All right. John, I want to talk a little bit with you about religion in South Africa. South Africa is often in our news. We associate it with the great problem of apartheid, the hated racist system that we find there. And we often hear it discussed in political terms and economic terms, and I want to try to look at it from the religious dimension. I think that's proper when we begin to think of Africa because religion is so tightly tied with all facets of culture and their long tradition. And so maybe we can begin to uncover a bit of the religious roots of this apartheid system and try to see how religion might be a force for improving the situation there.
Surely.
John, you spent some time there in South Africa, or that part of the world. You want to tell me just a little bit about that?
I was in South Africa for about 5 years, working within parish, church communities as a pastor. I was also a teacher there, and I also worked in formation of young seminarians who were going to study for the priesthood. And the theology level mainly, but also with the young people just beginning to think about priesthood as a ministry.
Is your congregation, what racial mix was it?
In where I was, the older fathers were basically German or Dutch, and the younger fathers are indigenous. They would be Namibians, or some of them were Nama, some were Herero. Many were what we would call in the United States, the common title is called colored. It doesn't mean colored in the old concept in America. It means that these are mixed with white and black ancestry.
And your parishioners as a whole?
The parishioners that I dealt with mainly were the Ovambo people, the Nama people, and the colored people.
Mm-hmm. And the first two are native African tribes people?
Yeah, well, the others are also, because they come from one of the native groups which intermarried in the past with the white settlers. Many of those would be the Dutch settlers. And in effect, a whole new nation was created because these people consider themselves neither black nor white. And so they have their own culture, which very much apes or imitates the white culture.
I see. Now, we have this system of apartheid, and I know in the past that it was often buttressed by religious sort of outlook or flowed out of that. There was the notion that indeed God set it up this way, that there be a group of people that sort of be put down, and I think they went back to the biblical story of Ham, that Ham was cursed by God, and these white settlers claimed that then this Ham was the ancestor of the Africans, and that they were really sort of an accursed people, and I think they used that in order to set up this apartheid system, not so?
Yes, they saw themselves in the beginning because they were a very persecuted group of people, the Afrikaner, who was fleeing from the British rule at the time, and they saw themselves in a new exodus. They were very much people in their tradition of the Old Testament, although they are Christian. And they read much of their spiritual life through the Old Testament. And they saw what was happening to them, that movement in fleeing from the British to maintain their identity as a people so that they would not be lost under the control of the British. And moving away to a new land is that God leading them and keeping them as his people and bringing them into a new promised land. And that promised land is where they settled.
Which is South Africa.
Which is certain parts of South Africa.
And they had come from?
They had come from South Africa, but they came from what is called the Cape area, and and moved away from the English area, where they had at one time been farmers, and they moved into up north a little farther into what are the Transvaal area, and these were the areas which they then began to settle. And in doing that, of course, they ran into some of the natives or indigenous black who were also moving south. and there was a...
When did all of this happen, John?
This happened at the beginning of the 19th century.
Uh-huh.
And
these are the people we call the Afrikaners.
And they set up their own government, Afrikaners government.
Right. And these are the people, their ancestors are in power now in South Africa and have kept in place this apartheid system, right?
Yes, this vision that they saw that God had preserved them and set them up as a nation, and that they were God's new chosen people. They saw themselves as those called into the new promised land, the land that God had given to them, and therefore their fidelity to God demanded that they preserve that which was given to them in their culture.
And they saw the blacks that they encountered then as nothing more than pagans. They had no real respect for their religion and saw their real task, I guess, is to convert these people, to try to make Christians out of them.
Yes, there was, when they would come, of course, they saw these people as totally other than themselves. But they also saw that they, as God-fearing Christian people, must bring them to the light of the gospel. And although in bringing them to the light of the gospel, there was always a division between them. They were still the chosen ones, and these, although they had been called to the Christian faith, and that they always dealt with them in a very familiar way. Nevertheless, they were sort of like these. They didn't always have slaves in the beginning, but sort of like the workers and the uneducated and the simple, and they really were not part of the community as a whole, although they were necessary for the community.
And one of the themes they have struck repeatedly is that the Afrikaners, that is, the white minority rulers in the country, is that if you were against them or to somehow go against their policies or systems, really puts you into the realm of the communists. That's been their latest 20th century thing, isn't it? If you in some way are opposing their way, then you're falling into the hands of these Marxist and these leftward-leaning people, and you really then fall into the category of being atheists. In other words, I think their rationalization was that if you were against the system, you were really an atheistic communist, and to be loathed for that reason.
The system is a theocracy. It is really based upon a theology, and that's right. And anyone which would tend to, in some way, go to change that system would, in effect, be trying to change what God had put in place. And they see, for example, communism, because of its atheistic background, as coming as a threat from the outside to destroy that which was set up even by the grace of God in their lives. And so it became very much entangled with their sense of who we are and what God has called us to be, and fidelity to that. And anything, particularly communism, which had no God sense in it, this would be a pagan and worse, coming to destroy what God has set. And they see themselves very much reflecting what happened to the people of the Old Testament.
You know, it's not unlike in our own country, John. We have that same myth, of course, as the founders came over from Europe, out from under the thumb of the tyrant, and crossed the body of water, and came here to the new promised land, to what we call the United States these days, and have a world mission again. I suppose you could see the treatment of the Native American Indians in much the same way. They were thought to be pagan, their religion was put down, and the only thing you could really do with them really was either to kill them or convert them. It seemed to be the policy. And so you see a lot of parallels between history in our own country and what has gone on in South Africa.
And in fact, the South African sees it too, and he will often bring that up. The difference, they will say, we came and we saw these people, and what we did is we gave them the faith, and they are still with us. You drove them away.
So they will claim that we've done even a poorer job than they have done.
Right, precisely. They say we have the problem because we Christianized them and gave them the faith, and we still live with them. We simply need to live apart because we are who we are, and we have been called by God to what we are, not to lose that, and to actually take these people into ourselves and to become one would be to lose our identity as God's chosen people.
Mm-hmm. And I notice that in the church literature these days, they really have gotten away from any sort of explicit racism, that old biblical idea of Ham and the accursed people and so on. They won't really admit to that anymore. But on the other hand, very often they still use the religion to buttress this apartheid system. They'll say simply that the system system really is not racist. It's simply separate. I guess, again, if you go back to parallels in the United States, you get that separate but equal notion that we had in the South and before the civil rights legislation.
They are very much in their churches, of course, are all segregated, although, of course, today in South Africa, many of the churches are not segregated, but there are still the traditional Afrikaner churches segregated, and they have what they call sister churches. They would have where one community would be all white, one would be all colored, one would be black. They have very many, they distinguish all the different groups. And the sense they will always say to you is that each one has a value. We must just remain separate, and they will not, there is no sense of going into worship one in another.
Is that a legal matter, John? Like what in your parish down there, if you wanted to have a mixed congregation, could you actually do that? Or
in law you can, but they won't.
You say in law you can or cannot?
Cannot.
Uh-huh.
But in practice, the government allows the religious groups which perceive things differently to have one congregation. Many of the churches, for example, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the Methodist Church, many of the traditional churches and the Lutheran Church, they will say there is only one church, and we are all called, and they use Paul very much, neither white, neither male nor female, slave nor free, but it's just Christ, and there is just this church. Now that goes against what the government says is permissible, that there are places which only certain people can be part of, and therefore if it is in a white area, only whites could be there, and if it is in a colored area or black area, only blacks could be there. But the government allows the churches that wish to operate as just one identity, one body, to continue to do that, although technically they could always say that this is against the law.
John, I was noticing an article by a Father Albert Nolan, who is fourth-generation South African. He was born in Cape Town and does some of the, what we call these days, contextual theology in South Africa. He was talking about the fact that very often the black people in South Africa began to take on sort of the false consciousness which was constantly put upon them by the Afrikaners, that when you're in a situation of oppression, you begin to take on the stereotypes that the oppressor wants you to have. In other words, you begin to think of yourself in an inferior kind of way and to take on that ideology. And he says, at least, that some of the black South Africans would begin to think that, well, indeed, if they did act against the government, it would be to move into an atheistic mode, that if they were opposed to governmental policy, they would be accused of being communist and didn't really want to do that, at least some of them, and that they would almost drink in that false consciousness of inferiority and so on. Did you find that in your time there?
Yes, that was very evident in some. I would say particularly the people from 50 years old and older. These people many of them had taken into themselves, internalized the message. And even though they were even the Catholics, they would say that's right. They believe that to be true of themselves. However, in the world today, in South Africa today, many of the younger people are throwing this off. And there is a tension, therefore, between the younger and the older. The younger people will say, no, this is not so. And the younger people want very much to work with the white community, that we are one Africa. This is often what they will say, although there are obviously radical groups. But as a whole, the young and the people who are working in that direction feel, no, there's a church and all, we are one.
Are you speaking now of what both the blacks and the so-called coloreds would be saying along this line, or is there a difference here?
Well, there is a certain difference in the sense that although that's very true also of the young colored, the colored see themselves as they don't know which side to join in the tension, and yet the blacks see themselves as working toward a one Africa. And some of the colored and in fact many of the young colored will go with that. That's what they perceive. Well, the older colored will say, no, we have to maintain our tradition too. We are not black, we are not white. And in effect, they have internalized it much more deeply than the...
and it would be much harder for them to overcome that, wouldn't it?
Yes, and I think there's a sort of a fear of what will happen if we move in that direction. Will we lose? Because they perceive themselves neither one nor the other. And that's a special problem for them.
Mm-hmm. There, some people within the system there, I guess whenever you're looking for social change, you'll find a wide variety of opinions. At one extreme you find, I suppose, very radical people who want to overthrow the whole system and wipe out the Afrikaners and establish a whole black state. You have other people who seem to be much more accommodating in their viewpoint, who seem to almost think like, well, the system just needs a few reforms and it'll be all right. I think the line that you hear on television, and especially when the South African government tries to put its best face forward, they're always talking about, well, we're moving, don't expect us to move too fast, you had your problem of slavery in the United States, how can you expect us to be straightening it all out right away? And it often seems to be just a cloak, a veneer for saying we're not going to make any fundamental changes here because we are entrenched in this religious outlook. I think it goes back to what you said. I mean, if they are the chosen people, they see themselves that way, it's hard for them to give that role up. To revamp the system entirely, to get rid of apartheid, seems to almost call into question or falsify a long history of thinking that they've got this task from God to be the superior people and to take care of these inferior blacks. So I think that you've probably got a very strong theological tension going on among the white Afrikaners who are in power now.
And it's one of the challenge to the church there, to give the people a new vision of what it means to be church, so that they can, because it is true, many people believe exactly that. As long as that vision underlies that there will be no change, there will be superficial decorating the situation, and that the only hope is that the church itself will give these people a theology which allows them to move to see themselves as a community of all Africans. This is very strong even in the Afrikaner church, in certain sections of it, where there are some people talking very strongly of the message of the church to begin to teach and to proclaim, as it did, that indeed it is not in Scripture that this is the chosen people, and that apartheid is ordained by God. At one time that was stated, that this comes from God. Today the church will not say that, the Afrikaner church. It will say, no, that this came from the historical situation, and so that there was a beginning of softening in that, and therefore some people are seeing, well, then the church is going to begin to take upon itself the role to lead. Now that's going to happen very, very slowly, because as you said, that is still very strongly held, that vision, that theological vision of we are God's chosen. And anything else is a lack of fidelity to the covenant. In fact, they celebrate the day of the vow, the covenant that they made to God, and that's a legal holiday, the 16th of December, when everything stops in
that was
an
historical event when they made this covenant.
It was the event where there was where the Zulu people attacked them, and they survived this attack by the Zulus, and they made that vow to God that if they would ever survive this, that they would every year celebrate that God had saved them, and because they were His people. And so they call it the Day of the Vow, and they celebrate this every year. Of course, it doesn't go off too well with the blacks, because it was the blacks who they were fighting, and so 87% of their people are celebrating, or are told to celebrate, a day which is against their traditions.
Is that right? Does the government try to force that celebration?
No,
on
it doesn't
people?
force it on them, but it's a celebration. Everything quits. The black people themselves will not celebrate that day, but there is all the stores are closed. It's a national holiday. It would become like our Labor Day, whether we would want to or not. There's no banks open, no stores open, and it becomes a day of prayer. Those people go to celebrate that they had become a people.
It's amazing. It's really important. I don't think a lot of people, John, understand the religious roots of this whole thing.
It's deeply, deeply religious.
Yes, and it really gives another twist to it, it seems, the way, the ferocity with which they hold this viewpoint. I mean, you can almost see where that religious sort of passion comes from now. I think it's important to point out that there's a counter-movement here, something that sort of parallels what we know as liberation theology in South America. So in South Africa, we have what is commonly called the contextual theology that, again, is of the people. It's meant to be a grassroots theology, to grow out of the experience of oppression right within South Africa. It's a theology that's designed to liberate and to move forward, to challenge the structures, and to help the people to find their own voice, to get over their false consciousness, and so on.
And in fact, sometimes it is approached that way, even with the Afrikaner, that just as in the past they have perceived God in what was occurring in their lives, that they are invited now to see how is God operating within South Africa today. What is He calling them out of? And of course, it's very difficult for some of them to say that God would call them out of a bond He made with them in the past, and so that there is always that a very traditional sense to be faithful to the initial vocation, and then the call to be faithful to the signs, as the Catholic Church tells us, the signs of God working in the times today. What is that God asking of the churches today to give them as a response to the people, so that they can have a vision of how God is acting within South Africa?
Do we have a comparable movement in South Africa to the base communities we found in South America and Latin America?
One of the problems with South Africa and base communities is the people live much of it's a desert area, arid area, and therefore the people are not congested. And when the people come together, they come together from very far apart. So we don't have so much an opportunity to form the base communities in the sense that they exist in South America. Although there is a strong, it keeps coming up within the bishops that we have to try to develop that within the people, more base communities. Some of the
that would be a difference, wouldn't it, John, that in Africa generally a lot of the more small group approaches have come from the top down or been initiated by the bishops, or that they've seen their role to be to get it started, where you get the impression, at least in South America very often, that it's more of a grassroots movement. Although the bishops there have been very important in it. I don't want to play that down. I don't know if there's a real difference there or not.
I think there is, in the sense that, remember when we mentioned in the very beginning that many of the blacks themselves had come to accept the system as it was, and that's the way it is. And I suppose when you live under that for so long, then you get that mindset. It's very difficult to say to people with that kind of a mindset, now you take over and lead in another direction. And so in a certain sense, although when you say it's coming from the top, it is important to realize that the top is coming from the indigenous people. It's not coming from like a Western or American or somebody from South America or for somebody from Europe.
These are indigenous bishops.
These are the indigenous bishops and the indigenous priests who, in studying and reflecting upon their church and how do we lead the people and what is the gospel speaking to us, actually is a response of Vatican II. What are the signs of the times for us? Coming to say, God is calling us out of captivity again. So in a certain sense, they're using the whole liberation thing that both of them are using liberation themes.
Yes, especially the Exodus theme and the covenant, yes. So you got a clash here, really, of two understandings of the way the Exodus applies to contemporary society.
Right. And I think that's a very interesting thing, because it is both of them they're both coming to existence out of a call to be freed, to be liberated, that God is calling us out of what we were, of our slavery and our oppression.
John, on an everyday basis is there a lot of preaching on the liberation themes? Is there a lot of talk of that in your parish where you were? And
in South Africa, if you preach a liberation theme, it is assumed that it is basically communist orientated, and there's a very concerted effort by the government which has control over the radio. They have programs on liberation theology, and in fact, in saying what is liberation theology, the logos that began the program was a devil, which basically shows that And basically they will use some of their own church people to say that these themes of liberation are not Christian but communist infiltrated, and it is basically a plot of the communists to use the church to destroy the government.
I wonder, with the softening of Marxism and the failures of Marxism around the world and so on, whether that is going to play into the South African situation or not. I mean, there's not as much fear of communism in the United States as we've had in the past. I wonder how that will play in South Africa.
Well, it's interesting because I think that many of the people, when you talk with them, the issue hasn't got to do so much economically, in the sense of changing the economic structure, although there tends to be a tendency more towards socialism. But the system is to be part of it. The underlying things of some of the blacks are to enter into the system rather than to overthrow it. Whereas in the East now we have a whole new thing coming up in which the system is being changed. And so it's very complex in the sense that liberation theology from South America may have this Marxist analysis, and that's still there, I suspect, with some of the people in South Africa. There is a desire to work together and to use the system as it is.
Well, John, that last point I'd like to pick up on the Marxist thing. I noticed that Father Nolan claims that, well, that whole analysis isn't Marxist, it's just human. It's just biblical to look at the human situation and to see what you're going to do about it. John, I appreciate you being on the program. I learned a lot, and I think what I got especially is this sense of the religious roots of this terrible system that we have there. It almost shows a way in which religion can get off the track and be used to buttress terrible kinds of oppression and a system of enslavement. And they use that Exodus theme in a way, I think, that really isn't proper. And yet we've got this counter movement, this contextual theology that really shows promise of trying to liberate the people, and maybe that's the side of it that would finally give us hope that the biblical message can be used to move forward, to make progress, and to move towards greater equality and mutuality in society. Oh, geez, John, that's good ideas.
Okay, now where do we go?
I don't know. That's what I kept thinking while we're going on at the end. I'm thinking, do I want to take up something new or what? I don't know what we do. But that's very instructive. Mm-hmm. I mean, that whole, the religious roots, I didn't even bring that out as well in the summation. But I really felt that we're saying. Yeah, very powerful.
Well, it's very much like Calvin in Geneva.
I noticed you used the word theocracy at one point.
Well, that's really what they set up.
Yeah.
Because they'll tell you that we're a Christian country.
Now, these people, see, I didn't really understand this. They were down in Cape Town area, the Afrikaners, and the English controlled that?
Well, you see, what happened is the English took over. These guys were the Dutch, okay?
Yeah.
They came from when the Dutch had control of the country. Now, they were all farmers. And the British came in and said, you will speak English. You cannot speak your other language. And they put all kinds of taxes on them. And they were going to make them into